Silence of the Lambs. Clarice. I hate the Farva beans line. I'm not even going to read it. I don't like that line. It doesn't make me laugh. I don't know. Every time I think about it, I think about pork and beans and human meat, which sounds really gross, by the way. I mean, if you're going to eat human meat, don't put it with pork and beans, dude. Gross. But Silence of the Lambs is full of symbolism. It is full of the idea of transformation. When we see the moth, when we see the butterfly, this comes up actually quite a bit in the film. The symbolism is prevalent. Everybody knows this. It's actually the poster itself is kind of a reference to a Dali painting, but it has the victims that we see of Bill himself. Now, there's a lot going on in this film, but the first thing I want to say is that back when I saw it as a middle schooler, or whenever that was when it came out, I had no idea what was going on. Going back and viewing it after having had a lot of in-depth analysis of MKUltra, reading those documents and books like Program to Kill by Dave McGowan, we can have a good insight into the depth of what's actually going on here, especially when we think about something like Project Monarch. Now, in the film, we see the Jodie Foster character, Clarice. She is training. And I read a guy's analysis. I don't agree with everything he put in his analysis, but he did have an interesting insight. I'll try to link his stuff in the comments below if you want to read his analysis. And he made the point that she's undergoing training, and actually, if you look ahead to the film, you can see the whole film as kind of her training into this program of maybe even being a killer herself. It's an interesting theory. I don't know if I'm totally convinced, but he does provide some unique perspectives that could make it possible. Again, we know that that's partially the case with the serial killer program itself. If you've read the Phoenix program by Douglas Valentine, you know that the Phoenix program is sort of the program that William Casey initiated in Vietnam to create super killer assassins. And so could it be that some of these guys who ended up being the big serial killers, maybe they had a background in Vietnam, maybe they were used in this way, profiled, right, to be psychotic serial killers with no qualms, no morals, traumatized themselves. In other words, they would be profiled to be traumatized. Now, that's what's curious here with Clarice, is that, first of all, it's not Clarice that's profiling Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter is profiling and learning about Clarice, and he's exploiting her childhood trauma and weakness. Now, again, we know that that's actually real, the whole childhood trauma, mind control aspect, because not only is it mentioned in some of the MKUltra work, but it specifically is in the John C. Lilly book, right? Lilly, that I've covered many times, the dolphin freak. He said that in programming and metaprogramming in the human biocomputer that he could wipe people's minds with LSD, right? And presumably also he ties it into the trauma and that people could be reprogrammed. Now, as to how far that program progressed is up for debate. We don't really know because we don't have access to all of those documents of MKUltra. But as we just covered with CampBot, that's ultimately a plan for society as a whole, not so much about creating these individual assassins. However, the individual assassins are useful because, as Dave points out, they can be used to kill people, to get rid of people. And it can go under the cloak of a deranged killer when it was something like a hit, right? So the thesis here is that Jack Crawford, right, the Crawford FBI character, and the other guy at the I forget what his name is, the guy who's the running the psych ward with the serial killers, he actually describes Hannibal as their biggest asset. Now, again, as an asset, that means that he's useful for not just helping find the other serial killers, but perhaps he's part of the training of the future assassins, you see. And so we have people down there with him who are spoken of in the film as being multiples or alters. There's even a guy, what's his name? Multiple multiple mark or something like that. He's in the cell next to Hannibal. But what happens to Clarice is interesting because she goes through these phases of kind of being traumatized once again, right? So she has gross stuff thrown on her. She sees the most horrendous ritual murders and crimes, and this triggers her back to her own trauma when she was a kid. And we notice that he keeps exploiting this, and so we get the impression that he knows about trauma-based mind control, and he's actually working with the guy who's the head of that psych ward. Now, so the question then that was debatable, I think, is not whether he's an asset that they're using, but is Clarice undergoing a kind of initiation or a beginning into this program herself, right? Is she the next Hannibal because she's been profiled and selected for this? Now, keep in mind too, there are elements that make it curious that she's just off the training field. First of all, she's doing training like the obstacle course stuff, and they immediately stick her talking to like the most dangerous serial killer in the country, like Hannibal Lecter. What? Why would you guys going from like level 1 to level 1000 right away? It makes no sense. We know about programs that have been used, not just the CIA's program MKUltra, but COINTEL and different kinds of subversion operations by the FBI. So it's not outside the possibility that if Lecter is an asset, and perhaps the other people down there in that horrible dungeon there. By the way, why does he have this fancy cell, right? I mean, I know he's helping solve crimes and catch the other serial killers, like the predecessor to Dexter or whatever, but he seems to have a lot of leeway. And not only that, like they allow him to do all kinds of things that just seem ludicrous. Unless they're using him to train the next people, right? So is she really there to solve crimes and to get Buffalo Bill, or is she there to be the next Hannibal Lecter? Now, again, I've not read the books. I don't really have time to read this kind of fiction stuff, but it is, I think, plausible that there are trauma stages that are being done for Clarice herself. And I do think that the film is talking about and hinting at the fact that Lecter himself is a subject of some form of mind control and is himself an asset, right? So I think that's clear. I think it is hinting at the FBI using these kinds of characters if they need to, or the government needs to have somebody gotten rid of. Then they would turn to this kind of a quack, this kind of a lunatic. And he's a cannibal, right? I mean, he's a total predator. He's totally beastly. And if you've seen the Manhunter, the predecessor film, which is good, in Manhunter, the killer guy is actually quite literally seeing himself as the apex predator. He's like, I'm more consistent as a Darwinist than you. I'm just pure animal, and therefore, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. And so they up the game with the next one. They make it a lot more dark. I mean, the first one is good. It's creepy from the 80s, but this one is even darker. And there's a lot of interesting symbolism in Manhunter that should be mentioned too, like the Mars symbolism. They found the candy bar Mars. Once you get inside the house of the killer, he's got a giant poster of Mars. But what's interesting, again, if we come back to Silence of the Lambs, is that Clarice is the lamb, and she was traumatized as a child by the slaughter of the lambs, right? And now she's facing the Buffalo Bill character who is slaughtering lambs, women, and skinning them, right? And so she feels like she can save the lambs or whatever. She can be this sort of savior figure. And when Lecter draws her, did you notice that in the background he puts the 3 crosses there to show that she is Christ-like in her potential sacrificial victim status or she's going to have to take the role of being the savior and be a kind of Christ to save the woman, to save the future women, and to get rid of the nightmares that she has, Christ, because she has these nightmares that pertain to her childhood trauma of the lambs being slaughtered. So I think that we see all kinds of weird satanic symbolism in the film as well. We know that the mannequins are prevalent in this film because the mannequins show us the idea of human beings from the vantage point of a psychotic. They're viewed as lifeless mannequins, right? They're viewed as robots. The serial killer, the person who is possessed in this way, you could say, sees himself as undergoing a kind of apotheosis, and that's quite literally what the killer here, he says, I'm transforming, I'm becoming pure light, this kind of stuff. That's also in Manhunter. And then in the other installments too, Red Dragon, I think, whichever one has Ray Fine, he talks about this, like he's transforming into the next stage of apotheosis. So this idea of ritual human sacrifice, cannibalism, etc., leading to apotheosis is all throughout these films. And so I think that is at root, pretty much hardcore sadism. I don't know how else to put that in a serious way. And so you'll notice a lot of times the film shifts to her vantage point. So you're seeing this from her, and then the camera will switch outside of her as if she's dissociating. It's almost like a camera way of demonstrating dissociation. And by the way, if you doubt me on this, I don't think I'm wrong, because Jonathan Demme, who directed this, went on after this to direct the Manchurian Candidate reboot. What's the Manchurian Candidate about? Well, it's about MK Ultra, it's about mind control and all the stuff that I'm talking about. And so that to me suggests that Demme knew what he was filming, and he knew what he was putting into the film. It's definitely about trauma-based mind control. It's definitely about the creation and control of alters. It's definitely, I think, hinting at the fact that Hannibal Lecter is an asset of the FBI in some capacity. I think that he and Crawford are the handlers of Clarice. What's debatable is whether this is being staged for Clarice to be brought into this program of mind control, or maybe that's not the case, right? That's what I think is somewhat debatable. But there are some weird things that keep popping up, like there's these sort of bizarre things that the cops and the FBI people do that when you're watching from Clarice's vantage point, they don't really make sense. And so, maybe the director's just trying to play with reality a little bit, or is it actually saying that like they're doing these things to trigger her? Like, why are they playing chess with bugs? What? Chess with bugs? Are they really doing that, or is Clarice seeing that, right? So are we seeing at times things from Clarice's vantage point that are wrong because she has a problem with, her own psyche and her own trauma? And they tell her that, doing all this will help her to advance, right? So, and again, she goes directly from the training field to talking to Hannibal Lecter to take down. I mean, something else is going on here with her. I'm not 100% sure. Let me know what you think. Do you think that theory is right? I'll link the article, the guy who poses that. I didn't get the whole MK Ultras. I already knew about that because I'd read several books. I think Secret Society Psychological Warfare mentions something to do with Hannibal and mind control. And then the Sinister Forces trilogy has several sections on mind control and MK Ultra being related to the film. And again, Demme goes on to direct Manchurian Candidate right after this. So all of those themes and symbols and images are present, but really we kind of have this smorgasbord of imagery that we're trying to piece together and explain what it means. It's interesting that the moth is the death's head moth. The moth actually has a skull on it, which could suggest kind of revelation of the method in the sense of like nature itself showing this symbolism. Again, it's always referring back to nature as this predator-prey thing, especially when we think back to the Tooth Fairy, right? I was trying to think of the guy's, the killer's name. He's the Tooth Fairy. And I think that we have, obviously, an MK Ultra thing going on here. By the way, another key element to this is that who does Buffalo Bill If I think that's right. Who is he? One of the last people that he kidnaps? The senator's daughter? What? I mean, why not just go kidnap anybody, right? He kidnaps the senator's daughter. Well, what did we read about in Program to Kill? The that very thing where you have serial killers, people related to serial killers, even abducting and going after these mind control people, going after very prominent people, especially people in politics. And so that suggests that this was a kind of a hit, right? Or perhaps staged to a degree, right? To, as Dave says, help foster the serial killer idea itself. And again, Hannibal Lecter is a big part of this. You could also view this like serial killers and this phenomenon was actually itself part of a psychological operation to make everybody think, oh, there's all these serial killers running around everywhere. So like everybody is a serial killer secretly, and oh, anybody can be triggered at any time. And so there's also kind of that level that's plausible as a psyop as well. So tell me what you think. What do you think is going on? Is Clarice being initiated into the program? Is she becoming the next Hannibal? Or is that a little bit of a stretch? But regardless, I don't think it's a stretch to point out that this film is absolutely about trauma-based mind control and controlled chaos through controlled assassins, you could say. And that these people, and by the way, Buffalo Bill, I forgot to mention this, the actual guy, I don't know about the guy in the movie, but Buffalo Bill is a guy who was a soldier, right? So we have a veteran. And we get the impression that Buffalo Bill in this film is a guy who's been traumatized. There's those weird pictures that she finds, I guess, at his mom's house. And what does he want to do? He wants to undergo a transformation, right? Cut off the P to go from being has a weird name like Gum or something like that, and he wants to become a woman, which is transformation. Now, was that a revelation of the method that society would go from where it was in the 90s to Buffalo Bill nowadays? Interesting. Tell me what you think. Be sure and like and subscribe and all that stuff below. And if you like this analysis, you can get my book, Esoteric Hollywood, where I do this type of analysis on many, 60, 70 other films, 300 pages each, 400 pages each. So buy my books.